First of all, let's give a big round of applause for Jesse for last night. It was an awesome night. Crazy awesome. So who here is awesome? I think you're all awesome. Go on, put your hands up. Who's a bit crazy as well? Freaking crazy. I saw you last night. By the way, I'm a mover, so you're going to be busy. Right, let's get this started. So, I'm the well-dressed architect, unlike Spuddy yesterday. He tried to say we weren't, but some of us are. I work in the studio team and help wrangle our apps into the cloud. And it's a challenge, as you might appreciate. For anybody that's ever done the Dragon Slayer or ever had to integrate two of the products, we have to do that every few weeks and do it thousands of times. So you can appreciate some of the changes we've had to make to the products. But why is the SaaS architect talking about behavior-driven development? It's a testing thing. Why am I doing that and not talking about studio? Well, for me, it's important for the studio team to be able to offer a lot more features. And at the moment, we are very restricted in what plugins we put into studio. And the future is that remote plugins will enable Studio to have a whole lot more features and functionality. So I would really like for all the plugin developers to pay attention, particularly with respect to remote plugins, because that's really going to open it up. But we've got issues with scale, security, resource utilization, reliability, a whole swag of things that are different in the cloud to when you have a more controlled instance when you download. I also spent the last 10 years in agile consulting at ThoughtWorks and HashRocket, two of the best technology consulting companies in the world. Learned a lot about how to write software. I'd already been writing software for 10 years before that. I was the hot shit, but then I found out about testing. Before, if it clean compiled, it was good, ready to ship. So I learned about testing, and testing's really important, and I find it is the sort of the proxy angel that helps us when we're in that rush to get something fixed and the tests tell us we've done something wrong. So I'd like to talk today about a technique that includes testing, and it's called Behaviour Driven Development. Who's heard of Behaviour Driven Development before? Who does TDD? I bet you don't, but that's great. More people, more people. So you plugin writers. Plugins are awesome, aren't they? How do you know what a plugin should do? We've got plugins that do everything. Some guy wrote a plugin so he can toast his bread in the morning from a Jira issue. Crazy stuff. How do you know what your plugin should do? You just sort of thought it was a good idea? Yeah? Maybe some users told you. Yeah? Particularly if you're in an enterprise and you're writing a custom plugin for the company. Sometimes there's a feature that you want to extend, or even maybe a part of the product that you'd like to work around and make a little bit simpler. So there's lots of reasons for writing plugins. They're also challenging. Who's written a plugin and found it to be a delightful experience? Exactly. So Charles has done that. But every Atlassian writes a plugin when they join. So we all know the pain that we have to go through. Sometimes the APIs aren't very clear. James apologized with his little cat eyes about some of the Bamboo APIs that have been cleaned up recently. Jira 5, an awesome new API. And Ryan showed yesterday some of the new features in Confluence that let you take over the editor far more cleanly. Sometimes there's just no API, and you have to dive into the code and find these bizarre classes that are deep in the bowels of the product, and that's what Studio has to do sometimes. We have to override some crazy stuff. But why do we write plugins? Well, they're rewarding. They're rewarding in various ways. If you're a commercial plugin writer, maybe you get some cash for it. But if you're writing a plugin for an enterprise in-house, then obviously there's business value that's associated with that. So really, it's worth the hassle. It's worth the hassle to write a plugin, as has been proven by thousands of people. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to make your life easier. That's a bit of a lie, because writing software is hard, so nothing makes it easier, really. It'll help make it safer to write a plugin, because Ian showed you some techniques and tips about writing a plugin to target multiple Jira versions. This is another technique. It's a little bit earlier in the development process. So yeah, BDD. So some of you have heard of it. Some of you do test-driven development. Who's heard of the tools JBehave, RSpec, Cucumber? Any of these tools? Okay, so there's some of the tools in the BDD world. This is an example of what you might see as a specification. It's really just acceptance criteria out of a story. So if anyone's written acceptance criteria, then this is a particular incantation, if you like, given, when, then incantation that helps describe what the user expects out of the system. So this is an example. Any of the Tempo guys here? No? Tempo's an awesome plugin for Jira that does time tracking. It's one of the first plugins I got to use when I first started using Jira, and it makes logging time really easy against issues. I'm going to use Tempo as an example. And in this particular case, when the Tempo plugin is enabled and you log in as a developer viewing an issue, and you see the Add Hours on Issue section on the page, you click the Log Work link, and you should see a period text field in the Tempo Add Hours Issue dialog. So that's a reasonable way. There's no HTML referenced here. There's no Java. This is just natural language. So we'll talk a lot more about that. What is BDD? As a technologist, I would describe BDD as test-driven development plus a natural domain language. That's as a technologist, but what BDD really is, it's a set of conversations that happen between people and that lead to the creation of software. Interesting. So it's not really technical at all. Anyone read this book? Anyone that writes object-oriented software read this book? Okay, it's one of the pivotal, seminal books on object-oriented software writing, and I thoroughly recommend you pick it up. Link at the back of the slide deck. So like TDD, Behaviour Driven Development is a design process. It's all about design. It uses mocks and role-based interfaces. Lets you explore the system before you've actually created any concrete instances. So as you are building out your classes, you understand the roles that those classes play and the roles that the collaborators of those classes play. And you can use mocks to build just enough to see how the design fits. And then obviously with TDD techniques, you implement just what you need to make the test pass. So it's about discovery. It's not about writing a big UML diagram early on and creating this class hierarchy. It is about discovering the roles within the system that need to be played. And those roles really map back to the business processes that you're automating. Great. It's all about you ain't going to need it and the simplest thing that could possibly work and tell, don't ask. So all those sort of design principles in object-oriented coding. And why do we do BDD? Well, there's various stakeholders. We need to collaborate. The most important thing in a software development project for success is the collaboration, the communication, and the understanding that is shared between all the parties. Using a natural language helps. We're techos, we talk in jargon a lot, but the business has a language. So the problem we're solving for them has a language. It might be field force automation. So Jira is used for field force automation to help assign people to various jobs. It could be time tracking. So we talk about things like timesheets and projects that we get allocated to and the amount of time we work on them. There's other natural languages, though, that we use too. The language of testing or stories. So anyone written a story? Agile story, XP story? As a role when I feature so that I can have some outcome. I want this feature so that I can have some outcome. So there's that incantation, that language that we use to focus how to write a story. There's also that other language that I just showed you, the given, when, then. That's the language of the scenario that we use in BDD for acceptance tests, acceptance criteria. And there's another language. So the domain language that we talk about in the business, anyone heard of Domain Driven Development, that book? Or that concept, yeah? So it talks about a ubiquitous language, that language that permeates all the discussions, the code, the tests, so that when you're sitting down and writing the code, user could actually come and talk to you about what they're doing, and you should be able to see the same terminology that they're talking about in the code, the way the code is created. So if there is an order in the business domain and you're automating order entry, then the order that's in the system should be the same thing that is talked about by the users when there's no computers involved. Who are some of the stakeholders? Obviously, the most important stakeholders are the developers, the business analysts, and the testers that are involved in creating this software. The business sponsors are there too. At Atlassian, even the tech writers are starting to explore using BDD, or the language of BDD, to help describe how a user would accomplish a goal using the software. It's a really great way to talk somebody through steps, how to use the software to get a particular thing accomplished. Even other systems and units of code are stakeholders. So we talked about the classes and the collaborators and the interfaces that you would create. So there are other stakeholders, and other pieces of code are important in this whole thing that we're creating, this world of software that we create, and they need to understand what's going on there. Oops. Right, so, sorry, the slide's messed up there, but Dan North is one of the creators of BDD. He says that the conversations that happen between people, he values them even more than the tests that are written. For us, though, maybe the tests in long-running software are really important as a record, a history of those conversations, and it let us, explain to us how the software works. And Liz Keogh, who's one of the other contributors to BDD, says that if you're not having conversations, then you're not doing BDD. So the important part of that is that if you're not talking to the users, the people who use your plugins, how they need to use the software, how they want to use it, what they expect from it, then like Don explained yesterday, you might be not validating your assumptions. It's all very well to spike using Speakeasy and create some software really quickly, but if it's not really doing what the users need, then it's probably not as valuable as it could be. So some of the benefits of BDD, anybody that has to work with SOX or Basel or any of those regulatory things, you get some traceability. But traceability is not just for regulation. It's also for allowing people to see the code and the thing that made the code come into existence. Why did we write that piece of code? There's so much code that's been written that nobody knows why it's there. But this lets us have a track between acceptance criteria, so some behavior that is expected of the system, and then come across, and there's some code that relates to that, and we can, we have this traceability between this possibly obscure code and the really easy to understand acceptance criteria. Obviously, business outcomes, the whole reason we write software in the first place. BDD helps us prove a feature's worth. There's a seamless mapping between the business needs and what the system does. Also, it lets the business owners get a better sense of, of incremental value. If I have this much to spend on building the software, how much do I get, and what if I spend a bit more? So BDD helps with all those things. But you're plugin developers, so what is it really going to give to you? You get those executable specifications. They tell you how the system should behave. You get to run them time and time again. Every build, checking, those little proxy angels checking to see that your plugin is still working and doing what it should. It's really easy to find a regression, either in your plugin if you've changed some code yourself, or in the product that is hosting your plugin. As you all know, it's really easy for your plugin to break as soon as a new version of the product's released. It lets you also test some of the forward and backward compatibility of your plugin. You can run the same tests against your plugin running on different versions of the products. And we already established that you're crazy and awesome, and I'm going to introduce an idea that is crazy, but it's also awesome, and that it's a thought that maybe even some of those tests that you write, Atlassian could run for you and verify that your plugin is still going to work whenever we make a change. We'll get to that soon. I'm going to show you a quick video. No, not that one. Come on, drunkie. Okay, the video is going to be a bit hard to read, so I think what we'll do, I'll go through some of the code first. I'm going to show you an example of a test or a specification. Is that a bit easier to see? So this is testing tempo from the plugin writer's perspective and verifying various behavior when tempo is enabled and disabled when I'm viewing an issue. So the feature is viewing an issue, and the tests will check that various parts of the Jira issue page respond the way the tempo plugin writer expects when the tempo plugin is enabled and when it's disabled. So let's just have a look at a couple of them. So when time tracking with tempo is enabled, so this second section here, red, this second section here. At the top, there's given I'm logged in as a sysadmin. So to turn the plugin on and off, you have to be a sysadmin. And then I enable tempo as the sysadmin, and then I log out. Then I log back in as a dev, and then I go and view this issue, BDD-1. So that's the key of the issue. Then I follow the log work for this site link in the time tracking module section. I should see the period field in the tempo add hours issue dialog section. So when we look at the page that it's related to, it's really easy to map between these acceptance criteria and what the page says. Some other ones, when I disable it, then I should see the default, basically I should see the default screen. When I re-enable it, there's a couple links. There's a menu, there's a link, there's a few places that tempo has to hook into the Jira issue page, into the UI, and override it. And then, of course, as fate has it, when I was building this example, I found a part of the Jira issue UI that tempo hadn't overridden, probably because Jira had changed, and the thing that tempo was previously trying to do no longer worked that way. So a clue for us to say, well, maybe we should provide a nice extension point for these guys. Because what we'll see is there's a lot of manhandling of the markup on the page to work out if these things are true or if these things exist. So we'll come back to these as the video runs, just to refresh our memory what's going on. So I've sped it up because we need to. So this is running Cucumber. Yeah, Cucumber is one of the tools in the BDD suite. It provides that natural language of acceptance criteria. In this particular version I'm using, it's Ruby, based on the Ruby language, and using a great tool for working with HTML pages called Capybara that lets me analyze the page and make assertions on it. What's happening on the right-hand side is the script that I just showed you before running and being executed, and on the left is the browser responding to that script. So we'll stop at various points to see how this is working. So logging in as sysadmin, you remember that? And it goes to the plugin administration and enabled tempo. And now it says tempo is enabled, previously disabled. So the script clicked that button, basically. Now it's going to log out again. Oh no, it's disabling tempo, sorry. It's disabled now. Log out. And then it's going to log back in as a developer. And then navigate to the BDD1 issue. And then what it's going to do is, that time tracking section I was talking about is over here. Click that plus button, because we're going to track some time against this issue. and then obviously Jira responds by bringing up the dialog for logging work. And we can see here that's the default dialog. It's got the time spent field. So just assuming that the presence of that time spent field means it's the default dialog. There's lots of ways to make the assertions, and this is just one way. We'll talk about page objects too in a moment. So, great. Spent is there. The assertion passed. It's true that I should see the time spent in the log work dialog. I'm going to log in as sysadmin again and enable tempo. And log back out, log in as the dev again so that the dev can track time. This time with tempo, again clicking the same link, but this time the dialog looks different. So this is the tempo dialog. So they've replaced the old log work dialog with their own. It's much simpler because tempo does a whole lot of the work behind the scenes that you would otherwise have to do manually. So instead there's a period field. So from now on I'm going to assume that the presence of that period field means that the tempo dialog has come up. Great. The second scenario passed. When tempo is enabled, we can see the dialog. I'm going to go back and disable it again. So I'm flip-flopping here just so we can see the difference between the two situations when tempo is enabled and when it's not enabled. This time we're going to use the menu. So there's another way to log work. We'll get to that log work dialog. Instead of clicking the plus button over there, we go up to the more actions and choose the log work menu option. Great. The correct dialog comes up. You know, it's the standard one because tempo is disabled. Oops. Coming back, enabling tempo. Logging in as a dev, going back to that issue. So tempo is enabled again. Yeah. And because tempo is all about logging time, they've added a convenience button up there in the actions part of the navigation. So that's just saying, look, instead of having to click over there or find the menu button, there's also this really convenient log work button to get to. So A, when tempo is enabled, we see that log work button, and that's great. So that assertion passes. And B, when I click on it, obviously, see the tempo dialog, which we do. It's not the default dialog, it's the tempo, so the period field is there again. And now we're coming to the broken test. Let's just go back and have a look at what the broken test asks for. I've tagged it broken. In Cucumber, you can various tags to run tests at different times. So remember, just the previous scenario, the one at the top of the screen, log work menu with tempo disabled. So it was that pull down menu and the more actions, and I clicked the log work link, and the default dialog came up, right, because tempo was disabled. I've gone and enabled tempo now. When I do the same thing, what should happen? The tempo dialog, yeah? And that's what this test is asserting. Then I should see period in the tempo add hours issue dialog section. So it's being very explicit that when tempo is enabled and I use that menu, I should see the tempo dialog. Given that it's tagged broken, you can guess what's going to happen. Clicking the menu, log work, and oops, that's the default dialog. It's got the time spent field. What it should have is the period fields that we saw in the previous scenarios. But instead it's got the time spent field. So what happens is this scenario breaks, it turns red, and it says that assertion. Then I should see period in the, there is no period, right? So it failed. So this test helps us ascertain that either something in tempo has changed, they may have forgotten to override that log menu, But the more likely case is that something in the Jira UI changed, that the way they were trying to override that menu no longer works, and that they need to go and find out what hack they have to do now to fix that. More appropriately, maybe there's a safe extension point that we could provide that lets anybody that wants to do anything to do with logging work be able to inject themselves into the Jira issue UI, and the Jira itself will know how to call back to that plugin in a safe way. So these tests can be relatively fast, but they are heavyweight in that they bring up a browser. There's ways to do it headless. If you're not using any JavaScript, you can do it headless as well, but they are pretty heavyweight. So they're not unit tests, and they do take longer to run. So you really got to do this. Choose wisely your functional or acceptance tests, the high-value ones, the ones that really matter. And for a plugin, overrides in the UI, so they're appropriate to run. So right, we talked about BDD, the given, when, then. You saw some scenarios, some acceptance criteria. It really abstract. There wasn't any code there. I can show you some of the code behind those scenarios. So let's try. So this is Cucumber talking to Capybara, and you can see here I'm reusing some other things. But this is where I start, under the covers, this is where I start doing some of the work with exactly how to drive the application. So in this case, the logged in as a developer viewing issue. Well, logging in is the login JSP, and this nice convenient OS destination, so we can go straight to a particular page once we've logged in. There's lots of other steps. These are some of the higher level steps. Obviously, so all these other ones are provided by Capybara. When the fill in, the press, right? These are using CSS selectors and looking for labels. So it's still quite high level. Sometimes you have to work with CSS selectors yourself, but only down at this lower level. So obviously that can get quite a lot of work when you are having to deal with lots of pages. In this particular case, there's only the one page, so it's probably not a big deal. But if available, Atlassian provides this concept of page objects. Who's heard of page objects? Anybody used them? Yeah, so page objects are a level of abstraction between that very high level English expression of what the behavior is, and it's in between that and the messy HTML that you have to deal with. So each page has a page object that describes the things on the page that are relevant to the product. So in Jira's case, there'd be page objects called issue and log work and things like that abstract away. So if you're using Java tests, these happen to be in Ruby, but Cucumber can run in Java as well. If you're using Java tests, those page objects are available to you to use instead of having to work out for yourselves how to determine where a particular part of the Jira issue concepts are on the page. So Atlassian maintains them. Whenever the page changes, we update the page objects so that you get that interface for you for free. There's also HTML. HTML is still an abstraction, and it's easy to walk across. Some of our HTML leaves a lot to be desired, and sometimes the code under the covers gets a bit messier. And page objects deals with a lot of that mess, but sometimes you still need to look at the HTML yourselves. But again, remembering at the end of the day, this is just some technology, some tools that enable you to have conversations with your stakeholders and record them in a way that then can be executed time and time again to keep you safe. What's this other crazy thing? What was I talking about? We've heard a lot about the REST APIs, right? So I'm really interested in plugin writers being into the remote APIs and using REST far more simpler way of talking to the applications remotely. Obviously, a lot of power there, and for more sophisticated plugins that are really mini applications themselves, this may be a better way to interact with the applications. And obviously, in the studio context, it allows us to have extended features that aren't actually installed inside Studio, but run alongside Studio. So Rest in Practice is a great book for anyone working with web services and hypermedia. Fantastic book, thoroughly recommend it. One of the authors is Ian Robinson. He also came up with the idea of consumer-driven contracts. What does that mean? So it's all about integration. Web services, people consume those web services, or other systems consume those web services. We can also apply this idea to plugins. Plugins are a consumer. The service provider is the product. If you're a remote plugin, then you really are a web integration point. And what it means is that the consumer helps define what the service should do and how it should do it. A lot of services get written that just do stuff in the hope that somebody will use them. And they do it in a way that's sort of a bit nasty. But you saw with what Ian showed this morning, Bonfire wrote what they needed in Jira as a remote API directly based on what Bonfire's needs were. That proved to be so awesome that, well, actually, there's a whole lot of consumers that need that as well. So it wasn't driven from the Jira side. It wasn't driven out of, say, Matt Quayle deciding, this is what I think the REST API should look like for issues. Now, he's got a pretty good idea of what it could look like, but the best way to define that was the Bonfire team saying, well, this is precisely what we need and how to do it. So consumers are driving the service definition and how it does it as well. And in terms of contracts, they're formed as tests that the consumer gives to the service provider to say, whenever you run your build, run these tests, and providing they pass, we'll be satisfied that the service is still doing what we expected it to do. So you see the tie in there with Behaviour Driven Development in that these tests are specifying the behaviour of the service. So in the plugin case, it's the plugins saying to the product, this is how I expect you to behave, because that's how I use you, and as long as these tests pass, then my plugin's not going to break. So there's a contract. Contract could be paper-based, but it's much better if it's executable and it's digital. So in this case, we're going to think of it, this doesn't exist. It's not something that's coming anytime soon. It could, but it's not something that's coming anytime soon. I just want you to think about this and think of the possibilities, particularly if you're a commercial plugin writer, but also for in-house plugin writers. Now let's say you have a source code repository and Atlassian has a source code repository. And we share another repository where these tests that constitute the contract live. And they're going to sit there and be executable by us whenever you check a new one in. We can try them out. So we'll step through that. So there's the green, our repository, your repository, and this intermediate repository that's a contract. Now we're going to use Git as an example here because Git's got submodules that are a really great way of two repositories sharing code. So if you use Subversion externals, it's similar but a lot more powerful. So you write some tests. They're great. You've done this BDD. It's fantastic. They specify how the plugin should work. And some of them are really a good way to tell Atlassian how you expect the product to behave. So you decide, well, I'm going to put some of those tests in this contract repository. Then you talk with us and we say, okay, there's this contract here we want to negotiate. What we'll do is pull them down and we'll run an exploratory build to see if they pass when we run them. And if they do pass and they look good, if to us they look like something that, yes, we agree that is how the product should behave in terms of your plugin, that's a good contract and we can sign that contract, and we sign that by checking in the version of the submodule that we're presently looking at. If they don't pass, then there's a negotiation. Maybe there's something in your plugin you've dived into the bowels of the product and you're speaking with some public classes that are there that aren't really the API, but you get access to them, or you're using some reflection. And we say, well, there's probably a better way to do that. And maybe we provide a safe API or an extension point for you instead. But once that contract is signed, every time we run a build, we run your tests as well. So we make some changes and we run the tests. And if the tests still pass, great, that plugin's still going to work. Everybody's happy. If they don't pass, because we've made a change, then that's a flag for everybody, for us and for you, to say something's coming that might be a breaking change, or we've introduced a regression, or we need to introduce a new API for you. And again, you keep developing your plugins. You make them more feature filled, and you have some more tests that you want to prove against the product, and you check in some more. Now, until we actually recommit, we haven't signed a contract again, but we can pull that and do some more exploratory builds, and again go through that whole renegotiation if necessary. But until we check in that new version into our submodule here, we're still running the old tests. So that's why it's a great, this mechanism in Git's a great way to show history of who's committed to the tests. And that's really fantastic. This will work really well with commercial plugin developers, partners, even open source plugin developers that we have a more direct relationship with. But Atlassian doesn't know what most plugins are doing. And a lot of the custom plugins that run behind the firewall that you've written for yourselves, we got no idea. But there is a potential way for us to have some idea. If one of those repositories was public, that we published, we put in examples of how to use the API, show some various code that people have committed, various tests that people have committed to say this is the best practice way to use the product from a plugin, then there's this shared knowledge base, this community of tests that you can use to inform yourselves about how to use the product from a plugin. You might have similar needs that another plugin has solved already. You might want to actually contribute some yourself. You say, well, I want Atlassian, even though they don't have my plugin, they don't know what my plugin does, I want Atlassian to run some tests that mimic what my plugin does, and I want them to check that they haven't broken me. And by committing to this public repository, then everybody shares their knowledge, everybody benefits, but you also get the benefit of Atlassian knowing when we're going to break your plugin. There's also that plugin checkup that was announced yesterday. That's a great static analysis tool for doing this. That will check unsafe APIs and so on. This is more of a runtime thing. There's a whole bunch of stuff that the static analysis can't check, and this will help for some of the more funky overrides that go on. All right, so even if that whole consumer-driven contracts thing doesn't happen, it's just a thought experiment. If you would like to know more around this afternoon, please come and talk to me and we'll see what we can do about progressing that. But even if not, the BDD idea provides a lot of benefit to you as a plugin writer and to your users. You get a better understanding of what the plugin should do. You get that executable specification of behavior that can run over and over. Whenever you make a change, you know that somebody's looking out for you there whenever you make a change. You can detect regressions, and you test that forward and backward compatibility with the different versions of the products that you're running on. So what I encourage you to do is have a conversation with your users, start writing some of those tests in a way that describes exactly how they expect the system to behave. Write it up as a spec. Find out about some of those tools like Cucumber, and then even give it to us, or give some of them to us, to see if we can run them as part of our build and see what happens. So that was some crazy, awesome stuff. It's weird, it's unconventional, but I think it's something that will help the ecosystem in the future. All you plugin developers help get early warning about when the products are changing, even with APIs as they change. We'll know before we even ship an early access release, we'll know that we've done something that affects your plugin and be able to start the conversation a lot earlier. That feedback cycle is a lot shorter, and it gives you and us way more time to adapt to the changes in the products and be able to launch versions of the plugins as new versions of products come out. Some of the resources that you should go and have a read about, including some of the books and the BDD and the DDD and all the different Ds. Any questions? Crazy time. Awesome. Thanks very much.